July 30th, 1853. Dear Austin, something bad happened yesterday, and it was all my fault. I kept thinking, if only I could take it back. Have you ever felt this way, Austin? Sometimes I wish that you weren't clear across the country, but rather home with me here in Sudbury, because sometimes I come upon things that I just can't figure out on my own. Jupiter, Possum, and I were out front of the house having a critters contest. There were frog jumping, turtle crawling, and worm slinking. We had lined up all the critters up and were running races. Most of the contestants were performing admirably, excepting the worms. They kept curling up and didn't seem especially interested in the notion of speed. Anyway, we were watching the worms and waiting for them to straighten out and move when Darcy Nightling came over from the widow Needling's place to fetch some molasses. She went into the house and came out to wait while Miss Amelia poured the molasses into the jar. Darcy was humming as usual, but looked different somehow. When I mentioned this, she began to grin. Is it her dress, Jupe? I asked. Is she wearing a new dress? Jupe shook his head. Seems like I was born in the old blue, Lindsay Woosley, Darcy said. Miss Pearly complains every time she's got to let it down or out. I stared hard at her, and she started to giggle. It's my new ribbon, she answered proudly, bringing her hand down to her head. That's when I noticed the yellow material tied in little bows all over her head. Miss Miss Pearly made herself some new curtains yesterday, and she said I could have the scraps that were too small to go into her quilting basket, explained Darcy. Be still on my heart, Possum teased, but Darcy didn't pay him any mind. She was beaming with pride when Miss Amelia came out with the molasses and told her how becoming she looked in yellow. It's my favorite color, Darcy admitted. She said, same as buttercups. I fixed myself up special on account of I'm going to pay a visit to my friend Nettie, who's feeling poorly with the whooping cough. She leaned over to show us a little bunch of buttercups she had pinned to a frayed collar of her worn blue dress. Jupiter, Possum, and I just shrugged, not being too impressed with buttercups. Miss Amelia smiled and went back into the house. Darcy stood talking about buttercups and telling us how she's going to pick a bunch for Nettie. Why is it that people always bring flowers a body takes sick when a body takes sick? Possum asked as he nudged one of the worms with his finger. Or when a body dies, I said, looking over at Jupiter when he was laying on his back playing dead. 'Cause buttercups always cheer a body up, Darcy replied, giving her brother a poke. Not a dead body, I told her. I'd think a licorice stick would cheer up a live body more than some old buttercup, Possum said. Darcy frowned. I reckon Nettie would be pleased if pleased to get a stick of licorice, but when I have the penny to buy it with, maybe you could give her something else, I said. Darcy twisted her torn ribbons as she tried to think. Jupiter sat up, put his fingers over Darcy's throat. It's what he does when he wants to hear a song. Jupiter's right, I said. Why don't you sing, Nettie's one of your songs? But she's heard I all know, Darcy moaned. I suppose she was right. Hearing an old song wouldn't be as special as hearing one brand new one. We all hung around the porch pondering the situation, when suddenly I had an idea. Why don't you come on over to Simpson's this afternoon around 3 o'clock? Henry Fenton plays all kinds of tunes on his fiddle for our dancing lessons. All you have to do is sit outside Miss Simpson's window and listen. You can make up your own words and even put Nettie in the song if you'd like. We all agreed that this was a good idea, and Darcy thanked me and said she would be by. So that afternoon, while Margaret Podolsky and I were waltzing beside Mrs. Simpson's window, I heard a familiar voice singing outside. Mrs. Simpson heard it too, and she stuck her head out the window to find Darcy Nightling and her friend Ida May singing along with the music, making up the words as they went. Be off with you now, scat, Mrs. Simpson snapped as she slammed the window shut. You would have thought that she was shooing away a couple of cats. Darcy and Ida May took off running, but later on, when Henry was playing the last reel, I spinned a head full of yellow ribbons back under the other window that was still open. Mrs. Simpson didn't slam the window shut this time, but rather went tearing for the door instead. I tried to warn Darcy, but it was too late, for Mrs. Simpson had gotten a hold of her arm. Ida May was lucky enough to get away and took off running down the street. Henry stopped playing, and we all stood frozen at the open window watching. This is a respectful house, Mrs. Simpson fumed as she shook Darcy's arm. I didn't mean no harm, Darcy tried to explain. The harm is that you are all here, Mrs. Simpson told her. Why can't I have a pack of pickaninnies hanging around of or proper folks wouldn't let their children come for lessons, so you don't let me find you under my window again. You keep yourself and your kind away from decent folks, or you'll find yourself singing in a cotton field under the shadow of a cottonelle where you belong. Mrs. Simpson's went on railings, but I couldn't hear any more of the hateful words that she was spitting out. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart as I watched the tears well up in Darcy's eyes. She took notice of me then and dropped her head. The sight of those little yellow ribbons bobbing up and down as she stood trembling afore as she filled me with shame. I felt my throat tightening as I watched Mrs. Simpson roughly let her go off her arm. Darcy turned and began to run, but she wasn't looking where she was going, and she tripped in a rut in a street. When muddy water from the rut splashed up on her dress, Lester Minner began to snicker. I grabbed him by the shirt and began to holler. That's when Mrs. Simpson came in to pulled us apart. After hearing Mrs. Simpson account of my attack on Lester, Mrs. Amelia's face grew red with the embarrassment. I suppose I was in for another round of punishments, but when I explained things to Miss Amelia later at home, she had no words of rebuke for me at all. Instead, she seemed real sad. But as sad as Miss Amelia's eyes became, they weren't nothing compared with the misery in Darcy Nightling's look. You should have seen those eyes, Austin, and those little yellow buttercups on her collar, all splattered with mud. I wonder if she can ever forgive me. Your brother, Levi.